Chapter 15 History Revisited. In April of 1992, Gleb and Peter and I had an amazing experience together. Pete had already graduated from college on an ROTC scholarship with an engineering degree and was now a first lieutenant stationed in Pirmasens, West Germany. He was part of the air defense system with the Hawk missiles. His orders stated that he would be there for 3.5 years. At about the midpoint of his stay, Gleb and I had the opportunity to come and visit him for about 3 weeks. We were all looking forward to this time together, and Pete arranged for some leave time during our stay. As an officer, he lived off base in an apartment where we all stayed. And, being an officer, he had his car there. Together, we had the opportunity to go to Paris, to visit Bavaria, and to visit the places where Gleb had lived during the 8 years he was in Germany as a youth and then as a young man. We found the Sonnenhof Hotel in the village of Bad Vershofen, where he and his parents had been slave labor. Though it had been converted to a Nazi hospital when Gleb and his parents lived there during the war, it was now a hotel again. We went inside. We saw the room off the kitchen where he washed dishes from dawn till long after dark. We saw the hallways and dining room that he swept clean, and the radiator behind which he had found that sick kitten so long ago, the one that lived to become a huge tomcat. The room where he and his parents slept was now a sauna room again. Outside we saw the train tracks where the wounded German soldiers were unloaded straight from the front lines. And then Gleb took us inside to the pool area. It was just a shallow pool where the wounded soldiers were laid to soak off the bandages and uniforms that were stuck to their wounds with dried blood. Gleb told us again of the screams of the wounded which echoed through the place. Then he showed us the hill up which his father had to push the 2-wheeled flat car laden with supplies. It was so steep. We could see how hard he must have had to work. Gleb showed us the forest where he would go to get the twigs to make the brooms to sweep the grounds. We stood as he showed us the walks he swept and told of the work he did. Here he remembered watching some birds. There, at the edge of the roof in the eaves, he remembered, as a boy of 12, watching the squirrels play as he worked. It had been 45 years, but his memories were vivid. What an incredible experience it was for Peter and I to be with him as we stood and listened to him relive those memories. Pete drove as Dad navigated. Soon we came to the first DP camp that Gleb and his parents had been taken in the back of an American Army truck. It was north of Munich in a huge field. It had been a former SS training camp. This, the SS Kaserne, is where they lived with 13 other families in their room. Now, 45 years later, we could still see the damage to the outside walls where the shells had hit. Panels of siding had been put up in an attempt to cover the destruction, but it was still evident. Now, it was again a German army base. We saw how far away the trees were from the SS Kaserne. How difficult it must have been for those thousands of people to gather firewood to cook their food. No wonder people were so anxious to buy the hot plates Gleb made and couldn't make fast enough. We visited Dachau, where Gleb and his parents lived for 2 weeks just so they could have a roof over their heads when they got kicked out of the SS Kaserne for explaining their hatred of communism to the officials. There had been no other place to go. As we walked through the concentration camp, Gleb shared again what it was like to see the concentration camp victims as they were brought to the hospital where he and his parents worked. The Allied forces brought the concentration camp victims here as they cleared the camps after the war. Gleb remembered watching the American GIs trying to help the victims, but they died by the hundreds anyway. They were the living dead. We drove on. Suddenly, Dad said, "Pete, slow down. I recognize this forest." I was sitting in the back seat. I responded, "How could you recognize this forest, Gleb? It's been 45 years. Trees grow." "But," he continued, "it looks so familiar." Sure enough, as we drove a little further, we found the Schleißheim Air Base way on the other side of the forest. The 2 hangars that Gleb remembered were still standing. The 3 barracks that had been there were no longer standing, but their foundations were still there. As we walked along the foundations, Gleb explained again that he and his parents had lived in the middle barrack. There was no firewood to keep them warm, so Gleb wired heating elements from the ceiling. They glowed like light bulbs. He showed us right where the Messerschmitt 262 stood, undamaged, and the Focke-Wulf 180s, and some Messerschmitt 109s. They lived in this barrack over 3 years. It was like history had come alive for Pete and I. What a privilege it was for us to be with Gleb as he re-experienced those 8 years in his mind, and how thankful we were to God as we realized afresh what he had brought Gleb and his parents through, and then how he brought them to America, brought Gleb and I together to share our lives, and then, in his grace, gave us the wonderful gifts of our 3 sons and our family today. Then, in the spring of 1998, Ivan, the best man at our wedding, died. He was a Russian friend of Gleb's who lived in Madison, Wisconsin. We had just returned from the Gambia, but we went to the funeral and saw Russian friends we had not seen in years. Irene, the daughter of Gleb's English teacher in the Schleißheim Camp High School, was there. Her family had immigrated before Gleb and his family, and they had settled in Madison. She told Gleb about the Schleißheim Camp High School reunion planned for that summer. In June, Gleb and I attended the reunion held in a mountain resort in Pennsylvania. None of the teachers were there. Probably very few are still living. It had been 50 years, more or less, since these people had last been together. At least 50 people came who had attended school at the camp, and they brought their families. One of them had painted pictures of Schleißheim as he remembered it. We purchased some of his paintings. There was a Russian Orthodox worship service of thanksgiving for bringing these people out of the camp and into a life of freedom where they could live and learn and raise their families. Though I then knew very little Russian, it was very moving for me as I watched them worship, many with tears streaming down their cheeks. And for 3 days I sat and listened to stories, all much like Gleb's, as they reminisced and spoke of their families' struggles for survival, life in the camp, and eventual immigration. They had come from all over America for this reunion, and some knew of others from the Schleißheim School who had immigrated to Australia and Venezuela and other countries. Almost without exception, they had gone on to college and obtained their degree, many going on for their masters and doctorates. Now their children were doing the same. An amazing percentage of them were now tenured professors at universities around the country. It struck me that they had learned to value education far more than the average American, probably because they had experienced what it was like to be deprived of the opportunity to go to school. They enjoyed speaking Russian, and they valued their heritage and customs. But, without exception, they loved America, and they felt privileged to be productive members of this great country. It was indeed history revisited. But these were not the only amazing opportunities God gave us. In 2003, during our first mission trip to Ukraine, Greg and Jacqueline and little Lucinda, who would be 2 in February, came to visit us over the Christmas holiday. And Anatoly and Yuri, some Christian Ukrainian friends from Donetsk, who had been in our home when they came to America to present their music and ministry, offered to drive all of us to Novocherkassk during Greg and Jack's visit. As you remember, Novocherkassk is the roots of Gleb's parents, the area along the Don River where they were born and lived until they were young adults. The trip was very difficult in the borrowed Ukrainian church van. We only averaged 17 miles an hour because of the horrible roads. Then there was much red tape and bureaucracy, first to leave the border of Ukraine and then to enter Russia. As we continued our journey into Russia, we approached Rostov-on-Don, today a city of 1 million on the banks of the Don River. Gleb's dad often talked about that city and that river. Almost surely he rode horseback where we were, close to the shore of the Don River. 25 miles further we came to Novocherkassk, where Mother and Dad were born and where they lived to young adulthood. A sign proclaimed the entrance to the city. We stopped for pictures, and after the pictures, Gleb turned around and just looked at that sign. Finally, he spoke. Never in a million years would I have ever expected to see this or to be here. It was thrilling for Greg and Jack and me to be with him. We drove on to see the city. We saw statues of famous Cossacks, men that Dad had told stories about. Then there was the Russian Orthodox Church, the 3rd largest church in all of Russia. It was built in 1805 and was named Ascension Church of the Cossacks. It holds 5,000 people. It is almost surely the church where Mom and Dad worshipped when they were young. They had fled from country to country during that tragic period of history in which they lived. But through all those countries they had saved one postcard of their birth city. It was a postcard showing the statue of Ermak, a Cossack leader or ataman. He had conquered Siberia and presented it to the Tsar. The picture on the postcard was taken about 1910. We still have that postcard, and we remembered it and the scene of the statue and the building behind it. And here we were. Here was that statue and that same building. We took pictures from the exact angle as we remembered that postcard. We could almost feel Gleb's parents' presence here. It was a very special moment. We toured the church. In the lower level, several famous Cossacks are buried. A service was in process while we were there. We found a large stone on the church grounds, which we picked up and brought home. A treasure from Novocherkassk. It was an incredible privilege for Greg and Jack and I to experience this journey to Gleb's roots with him. As we look back on our lives, on Gleb's life, How many times did God intervene to spare his life from almost certain death? There were the crayfish, that manna from heaven, that Gleb found in the Seine River, which provided meat for he and his mother when there was none to be had and food was so scarce. The crayfish were there for months, but 3 days before Gleb was sent to Germany, they disappeared. There was the time Gleb got caught in crossfire, when the man in the French underground was shot and dropped right at Gleb's feet and almost tripped him. And when they were sent to Germany, they were assigned to the 8 o'clock train, but got permission from the German guards to go on the 10 o'clock train. As they were still in France, they saw the 8 o'clock train still smoldering and totally destroyed. They got deep into Germany without being bombed. In Germany, Gleb and his parents were put to work in a hospital camp with red crosses on the roofs. The Allied forces respected those red crosses, and they were never bombed, though most German cities were devastated by the bombing, with great loss of life. And then there was Sergeant Ritter, that German supply sergeant who more than once risked his own life to get a small can of meat to Gleb. He is convinced that he would have died of starvation without that. Gleb and his parents found themselves in the American zone as DPs rather than the Soviet or British zones, which very likely would have meant forcible repatriation to the Soviet Union, which was like a death warrant. And God even kept Gleb out of Korea during the Korean War, when almost his whole regiment was sent there. And, as with all of us, there were probably times when God spared Gleb's life that he wasn't even aware of. Though Gleb did not know God at the time, God knew him and spared his life and brought Gleb to himself as his own child. Together we have seen firsthand that God's faithfulness is great. His mercies are new every morning, and his grace is truly sufficient for all our needs. And so we trust him.
In 2005, God brought us back to Wisconsin again. We're living in a condo in Franklin, less than 2 miles from Ken and Judy's home, the home that Sandy's family moved to the summer she turned 9. Now all our sons are married to incredible young women of intelligence, of courage, of integrity, of tender hearts, and of inward and outward beauty. And now we have the daughters we never had before. As of this writing, we have been blessed with 3 beautiful grandchildren, Zachariah Mark, Lucinda Jan, and Nadia Marie. And perhaps there will be more, children that today are still just dreams of love. God has blessed our lives so richly. He has blessed us with 42 years of marriage. He has blessed us with strong, independent, wonderfully gifted, God-fearing sons and our lovely wives and our grandchildren. Now I am 75 years old, and I can tell you that I have seen firsthand that God's faithfulness is great. His mercies are new every morning, and His grace is truly sufficient for all our needs. And so I trust Him. Together, Sandy and I trust Him. And we can say these words along with Isaiah. Surely God is my salvation. I will trust Him and not be afraid. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation.